Welcome to the history of Irish whiskey. I'm Barry Chandler, and since I've been old enough to drink Irish whiskey, I've been fascinated by its history. Now, I grew up in Cork, and I was surrounded by remnants of local whiskey history, from the old Middleton distillery to the various Cork Distilleries Company sites dotted across the city of Cork. Yet these distillery buildings and the ruins are really only part of the most recent history of Irish whiskey. And to truly understand how we arrived at the flavours and the styles we find in our glass today, we have to actually look even further back than the last century or two to understand the decisions, the inventions, the legislation, the egos that shaped the drink that today we call Irish whiskey. Now, in Ireland, we claim whiskey as being a spirit that originated on our island, that we beat the Scots and the Americans and all others to distillation. The truth, of course, like so much of Irish whiskey history, is a little bit more complex. I tell the story of Irish whiskey regularly, and I began to wonder recently, was I telling the right story? What we share as gospel today might be nothing more than a myth, or a yarn shared on the distillery tour suddenly becomes the absolute truth to one audience, and a well-meaning blog post full of inaccuracies becomes the cast-in-stone story to another. So where then can we find the real story of Irish whiskey? The history of its evolution, perhaps, all the way to present day? Well, it turns out that one man has not just been asking these same questions, but over the past decade, he's been answering them too. Fionnán O'Connor is an Irish whiskey historian, researcher, and author of the definitive book on Irish pot still whiskey, A Glass Apart. He's known as much for his entertaining and his staggeringly accurate tasting notes as his research and writing, and I asked him if he'd have an interest in helping me understand the history of Irish whiskey from his research, perspective and findings. So recently we locked ourselves away for 3 solid days, we turned on the microphones and we bravely attempted to distill, forgive the pun, 800 years of Irish whiskey history into 7 episodes, each covering a specific and very important time period in the evolution of our favourite spirit. The History of Irish Whiskey podcast is the result of our chat. And by chat I mean Fionnán and I talking, mostly Fionnán talking and me furiously scribbling notes. Of course, no 7-part podcast covering 800 plus years can include every event, every personality and every development. And I don't claim this to be the definitive, infallible recanting, but for me it was an invaluable few days tying fragmented nuggets of history to one another and then answering many times why a thing became a thing and how interconnected so much of the history of Ireland is to the history of Irish whiskey. Fair warning, this well-intentioned linear history has a habit of finding a rabbit hole or two to explore, and maybe even a side anecdote or 3 to share. But I think what we've ended up with here is an entertaining, educational journey through the centuries that could only be enhanced with a drop of the good stuff in a glass while you listen along. So grab that glass now and listen in to the history of Irish whiskey. In the first episode, we go all the way back to the 1200s to try to find the origin of the spirit we today call Irish whiskey, and we examine the subsequent dramatic and nation-shaping 4 centuries that bring us to a very different country in the 1600s. I started by asking Fionnán if he can definitively pinpoint the first mention of our favourite spirit.
If we're talking about hard references to distilling as an act, the first kind of bookmark we get is something called the Red Book of Ossory, and it's written in the early 1300s down in St. Canice's Cathedral in the southeast of Ireland in Kilkenny. And there's a great misunderstanding around the Red Book. Certainly in the Irish whiskey industry, it's talked about a lot, but it's not really read or discussed or examined. And the Red Book of Ossory, contrary to kind of popular opinion, is not actually about whiskey at all. It's not a reference to whiskey in Ireland. It's essentially a treatise on how to distill and how specifically to use a worm coil, the little windy bit at the end of a still, which at that time was cutting edge technology. And the Red Book itself is a kind of a multifaceted text. It's full of hymns and all kinds of other stuff. But this one sliver within the Red Book that describes distilling is itself actually a copy of an Italian manuscript, almost word for word. And that Italian manuscript was called the Consilia Medicinalia. It was written by a guy named Taddeo Alderotti. And that text is one of the most important parts of European alcoholic history. It was disseminated around Europe. It was a hot text, and it's just made its way into Ireland. So we pinpoint as, that's the beginning of whiskey in Ireland, the first reference to distilling. But it's not. It's part of Ireland's link to this broader European story of alcohol, of liquor, of aqua vita, distilled alcohol. And of course, Uisce Beatha in Irish is a translation of aqua vita from Latin, and that word gives us eau de vie in France or aquavit in Scandinavia, all of these various drinks in Europe that come from this shared kind of heritage. And so it's fitting, and it's not just the Red Book, the first number of texts we get in Ireland about distilling belong to this kind of Mediterranean history. And when we look at Alderotti, so if we hunt that text down, we have to go to the University of Bologna, one of the oldest colleges in the world, which at that time would have been a leading medical school, and Alderotti would have been the famous professor of chemistry, as kind of Stephen Hawking of the era. If you really wanted an education, you got as close to Alderotti as you could, and you listened to a lecture. And so and it's funny, the Consilia was written roughly 1280. So if we take the Red Book of Ossory, there's a little bit of quibbling, but the accepted traditional dating is 1324, which is only 40 years different. For medieval times, that's extremely fast off the mark. But it also means that some people say, maybe there was Irish whiskey beforehand and it's just described, but not really. We don't see Irish literature in the Middle Ages is enormous. There's the largest vernacular literature after the fall of Rome. There's loads and loads written about ale in Ireland, about wine in Ireland. Never a mention, not a single mention of Uisce Beatha. So it's fair to assume, bar enormous contrary evidence, that like the rest of Europe, distilling comes in around the High Middle Ages. And when it comes in, it's through an Irish attachment to these kind of hotbeds of European thought. And that story, while less mystical, is interesting in its own way, that it's part of Ireland's global history, that it's outlooking. And when we look at distilled liquor in the West, there's certainly the orthodox reading of how we start getting distilled beverages, certainly anything approaching what we would call liquor. We're looking at this period in Europe where European medical schools like Bologna, or most famously Salerno, which is, again, has even slightly earlier records of aqua vita. We're seeing Arabic sciences come in from the Middle East for the first time. We're seeing people like Avicenna, these Razis, these figures from the Islamic world, both Arabic and Persian. And we're also seeing the kind of reintroduction of Greek classical learning after the fall of Rome and the Middle Ages reverted. A lot of this stuff was lost. And via Byzantium and absorption into the Middle East, Europe was getting European medicine as well as Arabic medicine back into itself. And we had this huge leap forward, and distilling is part of that, and part of that development.
The Red Book of Ossory was written or copied by a bishop, and certainly attributed to a bishop, and we often hear the story of the monks are the ones that brought distilling perhaps through Europe, from the Far East, from the Middle East, over to Ireland. Religion didn't have a role to play in how you opened and described maybe the origins of whiskey. Where did religion feature, if at all?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is a bit of a red herring. The story we're always told is Irish monks brought whiskey back, and there isn't a shrapnel of evidence for any of it. I'm a big fan of proof. And it's also the wrong part of Irish history. When we think of Irish monks, we think of the guys who wrote the Book of Kells kind of stuff. Colm Killen and Aidan and Kevin and all of these figures. And they were long, long gone. That period of monasticism is like the 600s to the 900s. And I think it's important to distinguish that world to a certain extent had disappeared. But even the monks of the period, you're getting more of these kind of European orders like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Cistercians. And yes, the Red Book of Ossory was written in a monastic context or a clerical context, but it is not itself a religious document. It's a copy of a medical school's text. And most of what we see after that is not from clerical sources. There's no real descriptions of monks in Ireland distilling. Where we start seeing references in the 1400s, really. So the first use of the phrase Ishkabaha that I've found anywhere yet is in a 1415 or circa 1415 medical, what's called Materia Medica. And a Materia Medica is like the staple textbook of a doctor, everything a doctor needs to know. And it's a Materia Medica belonging to a physician named Abe Leon, and the contents is a kind of herbal, what herbs do what and so forth. But there's also, shockingly, the same text that was in the Red Book of Ossory, but was going all over Europe, this Bolognian Alderotti, but it's now in Irish. And we start seeing those all over the place. And there's a possibility that it came from Ossory. Now, it's not enormously likely because there's a little too much gap of time between them. And also when we look at the kind of Irish medical class, they are intimately, almost devotionally tied toward Mediterranean, what's called scholastic medicine. So Ireland in the feudal era had these kinds of families that they were hereditary castes. And the most famous would be the Brehons, the legal class, the lawyers. But you also get the Fili, the poets. And among that, you get this group called Olive. And it's an Irish word for a physician, a healer, but they're passed through family lines. You get the O'Shiels, the O'Lees, the O'Leans. So all of these scribes belong to this world. And these physicians routinely show up in Salerno, in Bologna, in Montpellier. And their textbooks, these Materia Medicas, are by and large either copies or cribbed versions of this European medical learning. And that's where we start to see proof. And that's where we start seeing discussions of Ishkabaha just as the Irish translation of Aquavita. And it's in this world. People like Alderotti or de Gordon or any of these big names in Europe. And that connection remains very strong for a very long time. And we start seeing, it's only through that we see the transmission of Aquavita into something a little more uniquely Irish.
These medical men then that had this knowledge of the worm coil, they had this knowledge of distillation. I'm curious, how were they using that knowledge? To what end were they applying the worm coil or distillation? Was it for spirits to consume? Was it for medicine? Was it for chemical distillations they were experimenting with? Help us understand a little bit about the use of distillation in that time period.
Yeah, it's from its kind of Salernitan Mediterranean roots, Aquavita is seen as therapeutic. And one of the first things they realise about it is that it's antiseptic. And then quickly thereafter, it's noticed that it stops things from decaying. And so even during the plague years, there's this idea that like we might preserve flesh, it might do whatever. And when we look at the 1460 Irish medical manuscript, it's ultimately stemming from something called the Lilium Medicina, the Lily of Medicine, which is a Montpellier text. But they're talking about gargling whiskey, literally, or Ishkabaha, as it was, rubbing it on limbs to cure paralysis, doctoring it with herbs as a kind of a tincture, thinking that the way you deliver ginger helps reanimate you. This will get ginger into your system. And you see these complex preparations based around the idea that this stuff was medicinal. And in most parts of Europe, in its early stages, spirits are considered either medicinal substances or medicinal substances that are being abused. And when you look at the history of Italian distilling, there's a lot of small town prohibitions saying, stop misusing Aquavita. And in Ireland, again, one of Ireland's first real Irish signatures is recreational spirits drinking. Part of this kind of Gaelic medical practice that was itself deeply Mediterranean scholastic, and that goes on for hundreds of years, much longer actually than other parts of Europe. That kind of Greco-Arabian old medicine strapped to a kind of native feudal idea of like castes of healers. So when we talk about where did whiskey come from, you're talking about groups of people or the spread of ideas as much as anything.
The use of alcohol in medicine is still commonplace today, but you hit on something there where there was at one point a transition from its use solely as a medical device to one of more of a celebratory, festive, hospitality-oriented thing. Certainly something we're maybe, as Irish, well known for and renowned for today. But talk to us a little bit about how that transition happened from medical to festive.
Yeah, and one of the kind of mysteries in Irish spirits history is there's really two kind of channels through which liquor becomes popular in Europe. One is the kind of apothecary model, where originally these universities or churches had, again, a medical role to play, and then it becomes like petty druggists and people abusing that, and it gets out to the township, and of course it's in the commercial interest of a shop to maybe sell it for other reasons. And Europe is littered with all these little liqueurs that come from this original understanding of aquavit as a doctored substance. And then the other big channel that we see going through Europe is the kind of brandy tradition, where you're getting wine fortified with alcohol so that it doesn't go off. And then increasingly you're getting the fortified wine sold as wine. And especially if you want to distill spoiled wine or things like grappa, wine byproducts, any of this other stuff, or excess harvest. So these are the two kind of ways that spirits are evolving, and eventually kind of wine or brandy is making its way around the Mediterranean based on trade, but that doesn't happen until slightly later. But then in total isolation from the course of spirits elsewhere, suddenly in Ireland it becomes the like festive drink of the kind of Norman and Gaelic feudal classes, and they're knocking the stuff back, and we get these, shocking records of them. And again, it's England at this point. There's a few records of distilling knowledge, but there wasn't popular spirits consumption in England at this time. England makes up for it later. But anyway, again, there's the question of like, how does this take off on the Celtic fringe? And yeah, it's fascinating. They can be very funny. You see these like accounts of Irish chieftains' funerals and people playing leapfrog and swilling ishkabaha and all these funeral games. And of course, it's usually from kind of colonial authorities who are shocked and somewhat startled by the whole thing. And so there's the question of how does this translation occur? And when you're looking at a lot of these sources, you start to see the medics in the same capacity, because they're not just writing text. They were essentially, you're dealing with a feudal world where if you're chief, you have entourage, you have people around you who are important you have a poet whose main job is to make fun of your enemies in front of you to your great delight. You have even the whole space is exotic and strange. You had bragatory with the infamous professional farting class to entertain you. They would eat specific diets to make sure they got gaseous enough to pull off the show. It was great crack, and you see this like ishkabaha being passed around, but you also have, again, the olive medical class in that space advising on the fare, and invariably we see records of them providing information about the digestive role of aquavita, and it was believed to have a digestive therapeutic process. There's a lot written about the country disease of Ireland, which is dysentery, but the idea that the morbid climate, that all of these things that were endemic to the country, cold weather, bad weather, the Irish ate a overwhelmingly disproportionate amount of dairy in comparison to the rest of Europe. It was a largely pastoral society, so there's a little bit of grain being grown, but the focus is very much on cattle wealth. And that goes way back. That goes right back to the Táin, the old Irish epic with Cuchulainn, the idea that if you want to hurt somebody, you raid their cows. And Irish people were eating what they called banbia, all these dairy-based foods. My advisor used to say to me, my academic advisor, he said, in all Irish people, long before the potato, the most primal kind of like dietary yearning in us is for like whole fat milk, butter, cream, and that goes so deep into the psyche. We describe the beer as creamy pints. this strange like dairy consumption, and that's very old. But of course, a recent arrival Tudor authorities very sick, and you see again like aquavita, or what they call usquebaugh, which is just an older mangling of ishkabaha, but at the time the word whiskey doesn't exist. You hear it described usually as usquebaugh in English, and they're talking about it's necessary for the crudities of the Irish feeding or this or that. And so even though it's festive and it's raucous and it's binge drinking, it doesn't lose that medicinal tinge. And what's most interesting of all is that when we look at the medical literature, we see them doctoring it again with herbs and various things. And when we look at the festive culture, A common story is that, they must have been adding all these herbs to just make it taste nice and whatnot. That's almost certainly true. They do, but the recipes are almost identical to the older medical concoctions. It's clearly the same material thing. And there was this idea that that fennel and anise and all of these substances cure different things or heat up your blood and so forth, the four bodily humours, all these old medieval understandings. And they're not just doctoring the final product, they were doctoring the beer before they distill it. So it's all very complex. But yeah, we do see this transition in this festive world, and we start hearing phrases that to this day, Jock and Doris, the drink at the door, the idea of therapeutic substances entering a world built on hospitality. And one of the most famous traits of medieval Ireland was overblown hospitable largesse. There's innumerable commentaries about you show up to an Irish lord's house and they almost empty the parlour. And I think it's a big trait of Irish culture that runs for a very long time, but this world lends itself to blurring something that was meant, even sláinte, the toast means health. Now that's true across Europe for a lot of different toasts, but it runs this idea, whiskey never shakes that idea of being medicine, right through the hot toddy, this vague lingering idea of therapeutics.
The makeup of that spirit then would bear no resemblance to the spirit we know today, and we're building over the next few episodes how we get to the whiskey we know today. What do we know about, you mentioned some herbs, fennel, etc. that would have been used. Would it have been distilled wine predominantly? Would this have been a pre-grain distilled spirit?
Yeah, so original aquavita, Italian aquavita, medical aquavita is a wine-based spirit. And certainly the first descriptions, both the Red Book of Ossory and the Olayan manuscript and associated texts, describe distilling from wine. Now, of course, they describe distilling from wine because they are literally copies of the Italian text. And wine spirit in Europe starts to mutate into grain spirit, usually in the, places that drank a lot of beer. So we see things in Germany where we start seeing like rye and barley make their way in instead. Now they're happening in these kind of like township areas. They're not really the same. And so we do see wine distilled in Ireland. The Irish drank a shed ton of brandy for a very long time. So blurring all of this, we see brandy coming in, intersecting. And of course, they're referring to that as Ishkabaha too, because it's a de vie, it's the same idea. And definitely, but there's certainly an increasing amount of references to grain-based aquavita for obvious reasons. The feudal Ireland drank an enormous amount of French wine, but also drank ale. Irish ale from the time was very different, A, to what we would think of as beer, and B, what was seen as beer in England. So beer, in certainly by the Elizabethan period, England was drinking malt-based beer with hops. And that was, again, more like what we would think of as beer. And in Ireland, they described this stuff called curram, and we know a lot about it because it was so disliked by Tudor administration and whatnot, this like muddy substance. And it was that they were not distilling, they were brewing malted oats and malted barley together. And there's a lot written about curram. And this sometimes it was just malted oats, and sometimes it was malted oats and malted barley in tandem. And again, there's all these complaints that, once you leave Dublin, you shall have no wholesome beer. And also, it's very difficult to grow hops in most part of Ireland, and hops are a preservative. But when we start seeing references to overt distillates, we start seeing naturally the distilled version of the curram. And so we start seeing oats at a very early stage in Irish whiskey. We eventually start seeing a drink called Balkan, which is from Willicown, literally madness of the head or bang to the head. And fantastic. There's an Irish poem slightly later called the Star Éamon Claire. It's a satire of a chief, and the chief, his great deeds, he's battling these ogres, and the ogres are various versions of personified booze, and he fights an ogre named Balkan McCurca, which literally means son of oats. But yeah, it's really hilarious stuff. And we start seeing, like, there's an English traveller, John Dunton, who goes out to what would now be roughly Connemara, then was called Ir Connacht, and he visits a chieftain named O'Flaherty. And he's shown a very good time. Again, this idea of like big hospitality. But he goes out hunting with him, and he's got basically a flask of Balkan. And so we see it pop up in this feudal world, and it's increasingly convivial. And of course, by proxy to resources, it increasingly resembles Irish ale, Irish grain alcohol.
So we're then seeing this move from distilling being the preserve of the medical men to perhaps the chieftains, and maybe in the 1500s more of more distilling being perhaps attempted by more of, let's call them, the general public. Would that have been something that would have been expensive, inaccessible, tough for the poor, impoverished Irish person to participate in, or did we start to see some rudimentary stills popping up in valleys and hills? And
we have a few material stills that have been discovered, and most of them, the earliest we get them is the 15th century, and so again a strong indication, we should believe the proof, that it is a late medieval arrival and an early modern kind of phenomenon. And yeah, it's strange in a European context. So what happens around the rest of Europe is you start seeing distilling being like an apothecary idea. It happens in this kind of semi-urban township pattern, and they know how to distill, and then you get the specialists and gilded merchant distillers coming out of that, or you get the vintner and the natural specialization of the winemaker as a side hustle to make brandy, and then some of them start making brandy permanently. And then again, like Ireland, once again, odd child in the class, you suddenly get this landscape of non-urban, non-monetary. Most of Ireland was outside the Pale was a barter-based economy. The Pale, as in the area in and around Dublin, that was by this time really the only part of Ireland outside small coastal towns that was under Tudor control and B, using cash. And when people go into the interior, it all reverts to barter very fast. And of course, you wonder, like, okay, there's no money is passing hands. You have this culture socially built on hospitable largesse. There's a lot written about Irish hospitality, not just at the feudal level, but right down the system. There was a strong taboo, and there's a lot written about this part of Ireland. A whole series of taboos based on hospitality, based on the idea that if someone shows up at your door, you need to put them up. And if you don't, there's something deeply spiritually malignant in you, and probably the people around you will note it, and then you'll have social repercussions in infinite discrete ways. And so it's, again, in ancient Greece, you see something similar when you see in like the Odyssey, this idea of like you need to put people up. But then similarly, if you abuse it, there's something wrong with you as well. And we start seeing imitations of the higher feudal orders down the rung. And again, the best description I was given, because it does survive in Irish culture, the way that if someone comes to your house in Ireland, as an Irish person, you almost feel jittery until you offer them a cup of tea. Can I get you anything? It's a nervous reaction. And all of these discrete kind of survivals of this originally deeply embedded idea of obligation to host, and to host with whatever resources are available as lavishly as you can. And it's there and in that space that we first start seeing usquebaugh appear down the social rung. You start getting the idea of, like, there's a word called taingy that disappeared, but this idea of like offering somebody a drink upon arrival. All these weird hospitable gestures. And it's all to do with social reciprocity. I put someone up in my home because I might have to travel one day, and I want to make sure that in a pre-monetary, there's no such thing as inns in these places. I want to make sure that I can have somewhere to stay. And it's all tied in with this. And we start seeing in these spaces aquavita recurringly appear. It's part of the social landscape. You're talking about a heavily forested landscape, a lot of boggy terrain, not a lot of roads. Travel can be difficult and dangerous and cold and wet. And the therapeutic mixes with the luxury in this, again, like wider sense of social context. And that's where it pops up.
The story of alcohol, the story of whiskey, reflects the social changes, the political changes, the economic changes in the countries where that alcohol stems from. Ireland changed dramatically in the early 1600s. The Battle of Kinsale, 1601, created a marked change in the direction of Ireland as a country and an economy. Can you talk a little bit about what changes we saw in Ireland at the time and how that then affected what became the whiskey we know?
Yeah, I mean, Kinsale is an enormous turning point. It can't be overstated. A lot of what we think of as Ireland, rolling hills, green hedges, all that stuff, settled tillage, that's a result of this turning point. That's not the natural landscape. Before that, again, Ireland looks physically very different, culturally very different. Socially, there's not a lot of money used as you go inland. There is on the coastal towns. There's a whole grey market of barter in the middle, and that's another area where we start seeing aquavita pop up. But before then, so in the 1500s, the time we're talking about, really from the 1300s to the 1500s, Ireland was split between Dublin and the area around, the Pale, which was its own kind of concept, and these coastal towns, and then a world where the old Norman ruling class had gone wild and native in the interior and started to resemble their kind of Gaelic chieftain neighbours. And their cultures became in this strange hybridity. You get this, the Normans took to all this like ducks to water. Deeply feudal culture based on allegiance, based on, again, hospitable reciprocities, all this stuff, some of which looks a lot like feudal Europe and some of which is quite strange. And you get, like for instance, tied up with the hospitable gestures, you get things like cuddying, where Gaelic chiefs would go the rounds of their subjects and be expected to be put up. And the Tudors are always saying they're just living off the fat of the land. And so, for instance, I mean, we're down the road from a McCarthy castle, and there's references to McCarthy cutting around the southwest, and he's being given aquavita. And then eventually he gets cheeky and starts saying, instead of me showing up, maybe you can just send it to the castle and I'll drink it here. And so it blurs with tax at that point. But we start seeing, again, that whole world collapse. It collapses with Kinsale. It collapses with the flight of the Earls. First of all, half the aristocracy just disappear. They were in the lead up to Kinsale. You have what's called the 9 Years' War, and the 9 Years' War is sparked by tension between the Tudor government and originally Ulster, O'Neill and O'Donnell specifically, and then it rapidly spreads into a big all-Ireland war and nearly bankrupts the exchequer of the Tudor government. They spent 2 million sterling on it. Spain eventually gets involved on the Irish side, which makes the English really worried that they're facing down a second Armada type experience. So they really start putting money and manpower into this. And when when the Irish and the Spanish lose the Battle of Kinsale, O'Neill and the gang were actually originally pardoned, and there's a little bit of a hush period, and then they get very nervous that the pardon's not going to last long, or this or that, and they basically disappear to Europe. And within a very rapid space of about 20 years, the English government not only starts to actually control Ireland in any meaningful sense, as opposed to just the Pale, but convert the country towards a monetary economy, market towns. You start seeing heavy deforestation had started just before and continues. And the idea of trying to get the Irish to settle down and become farmers, market townspeople, small market town and farmland periphery. The whole landscape changes, starts to look much more like what we think of as Ireland. And that transformation also means that there's a lot more tillage in Ireland. So there were cereal crops in Ireland before, but not on the kind of like more ordered, systematized way. We start seeing more wheat. We start seeing more, again, 3-crop rotation looking stuff, more organized. And a country that has changed not just in the use of money, but in its physical appearance in so many different ways. It looks unrecognizable very soon to what it had looked like for a very long time beforehand.
The change of Ireland then, the loss at the hands of the British at the Battle of Kinsale, you talk about it putting Ireland on a path to being a little bit more British and being more of an economy and something resembling the British system. That had a massive effect on deforestation, cutting down of the oak trees. We were, 3/4 of the country was covered in forest at one point, or perhaps more. And now we're moving into this new era where the country is open land. There are fields that are tilled, that are managed, where crops are grown. That was probably a big driver of the use of grain then. There was more grain available perhaps. Would that have contributed to an increase in the usage of local available grains in the Uisce that became the whiskey that we know today. So are we seeing more of the rise of grain-based whiskies then?
Yeah, and we certainly see a lot less. The Usquebaugh of the previous years had been a product of feudal largesse. Some of the ingredients they put in it, like saffron, overwhelmingly more expensive than necessity requires. You're showing off as much as anything. Sometimes it's a form of intimidation. You take people to your house and you show them how much money you have discreetly, and then you get them drunk. And that world is gone. You see more plain spirit, and also you see, again, a switch to like a peasant distiller class. It becomes wider spread. And again, it's invariably tied up with landscape at all parts of history. It is a reflection of Irish agricultural history. And so when we start seeing more organised tillage, of course we start seeing more tillage booze. And similarly, again, Ireland moves into a different, how would you put it? I mean, so much changes. The food changes, the drink changes, the language starts to be on the back foot. There's a whole like dimension that Ireland passes through, and it happens roughly like from there to 1661. By the time we get the Restoration in England, the end of Oliver Cromwell, by the time we've come that far in history, Ireland looks unrecognisable.
Shortly after the Battle of Kinsale, King James I ascends to the throne. He succeeds Queen Elizabeth. He has maybe a more moderate approach, but he also recognises the distiller class that has grown. He recognises the distilling that has taken place throughout the country, and while we're not yet at a time period where taxes start to be applied, he has a clever method of perhaps extracting some money in return for distilling happening. Tell us a little bit about what James I did with whiskey.
Yeah, so first of all, when James takes over and Queen Elizabeth died without an heir and the Stuarts replaced the Tudors, because they were already related, so you're getting a huge change of governance in England. He inherits a throne that is nearly bankrupted itself between wars with Spain, and then, again, there's just enormous expenditure in the 9 Years' War. And he's trying to foot the bill, basically. And he sets up this system, what we call patents. And if you had the patent for something, you had the exclusive right, in theory you had the exclusive right to collect money on behalf of the Crown, and you're supposed to pay for the patent and the Crown got money from you. But it's just cronyist legislation about like, I have the patent for shoe cobbling, and anyone who wants to cobble shoes now owes me money for no real discernible reason other than I'm the great kingly shoe man. And we start seeing, they're handed out for distilling as well, 4 of them in and around 1608. And these aren't licenses for distilling, they're essentially a tax right, and then what happens is the patents get farmed out. So if you have the patent and you can't make it as far as your patent extends, you can say, okay, Jimmy down the road can collect on my behalf as long as he pays me for the privilege. And then he wants to farm it out and someone pays him. And you get this, essentially this racket of a pyramid scheme, basically. And then finally, the patents, which were seen as generating very little money for the Crown and very, heavy levels of resentment, they're finally done away with. And we start seeing more organised concepts like first tax on sale and then excise.
One of these patents will be familiar to people because if you pick up any bottle of Bushmills, you'll see embossed on the glass the date 1608, which would reference one of these early licenses or patents to distill granted by King James I to that area. So that would be one example of, it's something that Bushmills points to.
Yeah, it's, that was handed to a guy named Thomas Phillips, who was based in Limavady. He was essentially part of the administration, and his patent would have reached across Antrim and then up as far as Derry. And this idea of, they weren't making alcohol, they were essentially living off those who did. They had the right to collect or to extend that to others and to be in charge. And again, license in this sense means something very different. It's not. Distilleries as commercial concepts didn't really exist. That's a later stage. Again, you're starting to see trade distillation in a small way. You start seeing inns, which is another thing that changes with Ireland. With the collapse of the old kind of feudal order, you start seeing, with money, commerce. And so that's a big priority for James's government is the setting up of inns, because before, yes, you could go through the Irish interior and sleep anywhere for free, but you're suddenly in a lot of people's debt, and if they're giving you booze and you've said something in the morning that you regret having said and this and that, you become entangled very, very quickly in this kind of social swamp. And it was very important that if soldiers are going in or somebody's going in, they need to throw cash down on the table and say, you're billeting my horses, I'm staying here for the night, I'm getting dinner, and you're getting money in return. And you start seeing distiller publicans. You start seeing people essentially turning their ale into a kind of a motley whiskey of a kind. And that exists as a kind of a semi-trade, but we don't see distilleries as we think of them until later.
In the next episode of the History of Irish Whiskey, we're going to get to that next phase of Ireland's whiskey history as we discuss the birth of the distillery, we see the arrival of the word whiskey, and we examine the circumstances that led to whiskey becoming more commonplace throughout the island of Ireland, as we cover the period from 1661 right up until 1760. The History of Irish Whiskey is a presentation of the Stories and Sips Whiskey Club, and the entire 7-episode season of the History of Irish Whiskey is available exclusively to Whiskey Club members, with a new episode released each week. Membership of the Stories and Sips Whiskey Club is open to whiskey fans anywhere in the world, and to become a member and to listen to the rest of this podcast season, catch up on our behind-the-scenes distillery visits, watch our Meet the Maker events with some of Ireland's leading distillers and blenders and makers, simply visit storiesandsIps.com/club. Membership is month to month. We have no long-term commitments. You're free to cancel your membership any time, no questions asked, but of course, we hope you'll stick around as we learn more about Irish whiskey together. A big thank you to Fionnán O'Connor for sharing incredible whiskey history, his knowledge and his perspective, and putting in one place, finally, the history of Irish whiskey for us to learn from and even help us to appreciate more the spirit we call Irish whiskey today. Sláinte.